are talking about Aqeedah, we're talking about creed. When we talk about belief and we talk about fiqh, the belief that we're talking about here is belief that is obligatory and which is also a matter of consensus that is based on conclusive, indisputable proof. What we believe about God is vast, and we can talk about many things about reality and the nature of reality and the knowledge of God and so forth. But in Aqeedah, we are focusing on conclusive basic beliefs. Shaykh Walid was talking about this fact that we have in Islam 4 schools of law, right? We have the school of Al-Imam Al-A'zam, Abu Hanifa, may Allah be pleased with Imam Malik, Imam Al-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and we believe that all of these schools are valid. But one of the reasons why the schools vary is because most of what is the basis of the law, most of the verses of the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet and the different sources that we get the law from, when they pertain to fiqh, they are open to interpretation. They are dhanni, which is sort of like saying mutashabihat, even though we don't use the word that way. And so therefore, to know how do you understand these hadith, how do you understand these verses, then you have to have people who do ijtihad, who have methods by which they interpret that are consistent with themselves. For that reason, a school like the school of Imam Abu Hanifa is a distinctive methodology. And the school of Imam Malik is a different methodology. It approaches the sources of the law in somewhat a different way. And it interprets those sources of the law consistently, but in somewhat a different way. Imam al-Shafi'i, may Allah be pleased with him, has a third methodology, which is sound, but differs from the other two. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, may Allah be pleased with him, he has a fourth methodology. And his is also a valid and a consistent methodology. So this is how we get the differences in the school. And there's no escape from this. This is part of the wisdom of the way that Allah revealed His religion, that in it there is the foundational base. And this is what we depend on. And around that, then you have various interpretations that come from the different indications of the Quran and of the Hadith and of human thought and so forth. Okay, so the Aqeedah, therefore, is giving us a base, a foundation. And it is not of the nature of this Aqeedah to put in it anything that is inconclusive, even though those things that are inconclusive be true, or probably be true. Okay, so for example, if we take an issue like the issue of intercession, the intercession with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the intercession with saints, in our tradition, that would actually be regarded as a question of law and not as a question of Aqeedah. The reason for that is that although there are proofs in the Quran and in the Hadith for intercession, they are not conclusive. They are not qat'i. So we don't make that a matter of belief, that if you believe in this, you're a believer, and if you don't believe in it, you're not a believer. We leave it on the side. It becomes an issue of the law, where some people could say it's mandub, recommendable, others could say that it's permissible, and others could even say it's makruh. Okay, because there are different points of view in these things. So that's very important, that there is a basic methodology in the law in which we distinguish between the beliefs and also between the foundations and the precepts of the law that are known conclusively, that are matters of consensus, and these are preferred over everything else, and then other matters that are on the periphery in which we have different points of view and we have different interpretations. Okay, so that's what the Aqidah is. It's a particular type of a creed, and it's very important to begin here. He calls this creed the creed of salvation, Aqeedatun-Najah. As I mentioned yesterday, Shaykh Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Qattani was asked by his Shaykh, Muhammad Ahmad al-Dandarawi, to write this poem and to make it only the most basic of beliefs. And then among the basic beliefs, to make this the most basic of the basic. Therefore, in doing that, his conviction is, and the conviction of the people like his Shaykh who received this from him, that if you know this, you have all that you need to know in order to please God and in order to meet the basic requirement of belief. So therefore, it is a creed of salvation. Your salvation to be accepted by Allah and to know Him in a way that is true and valid. If you know this, it is enough. And what you learn in addition to that, as long as it is consistent with that, it is additional to that. Okay? Are there any questions about that point? Any questions about what I've said so far? Intercession is when you intercede. You ask God to intercede for you through the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, tawassul or istighatha, things like that. And you won't find that in the Aqidas. You don't find that in the Aqidas because that is a matter that is essentially a legal matter. In the definition of sects in Islam and heresies, one of the major guidelines by which we declare something to be a heresy is the fact that heresies and sects in Islam, they put in the Aqidah things that don't belong there. So for example, to say that the basic Aqidah is to reject intercession, as some Muslims do, that would also be heretical, because of the fact that this is a matter in which there are different opinions. And so therefore you cannot take a particular interpretation and make it an article of faith. That if people accept it, they believe, and if they reject it, they disbelieve. This is a very important thing. In the history of the Christian church, the early church is a Unitarian church. It believes in one God. It accepts, the beliefs of the children of Israel before. And the Trinity, as it develops in Christianity, develops over hundreds of years. It has actually 5 very clear stages of historical development. In the 4th century of the Christian era, there is a great debate between Arius of Alexandria, who insisted on the unity of God, and between others, especially a man named Athanasius, who is one of the fathers of the church that will instill the beliefs that lead to the belief in the divinity of Christ and then ultimately in the Trinity. And Arius was a very conservative representative of the Church of Alexandria. And he was also an heir of the oral tradition. In his debates with Athanasius and those who were insisting on the divinity of Christ, one of the main points that Arius made is that in the Bible, it is very clear that God is one, and that God is pre-existent, that He has no beginning and He has no end, and that He is unlike anything in creation. And anything that the Bible may say, the Gospels, for example, about the greatness of Christ, these are metaphorical, or these are open to different interpretations. None of them are conclusive statements, and they must be understood in a way that does not violate the basic principles of the belief in the oneness of God. This is essentially the Quranic position. The verses that we refer to in Surah Ali Imran that talk about the distinction between the verses that are muhkamat, that are firmly established and clear, and between the verses that are mutashabihat, that are not that way. They need interpretation, and they are open to interpretation. This was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ when a delegation of Christians came to him from Najran, and they raised these issues that pertain to things like the Trinity. So in establishing this position, which is really important in our religion, the instance of the revelation is the fact that this is where the Christians went wrong. And when they come to speak to the Prophet ﷺ, the Quran institutes this principle of faith. And in that, interestingly, it insists on the same position that Arius of Alexandria had insisted upon in the very beginning of Christianity. So this is really important. And this is why in Islam our unity is based on matters of consensus. Things that we all accept and we all agree on, and we have to do that. And in other matters that are open to interpretation, those are issues of ijtihad, and there we tolerate and we welcome the different positions that people take based on those sound interpretations. Okay, so he says there in verse number 1, قال محمد هو ابن جعفر لقب كتان عليه قد جرى. If you look in your book on page 5, this first verse, you need to put an alif after the ra of Ja'far. And here the word Ja'far is pronounced as Ja'fara, simply for the metrics. Okay, the word Ja'far in Arabic is, we have two types of nouns. We have those that take full declension and that take tenween, and we have those that don't. Like you have, and Ja'far is one of those that takes a full declension. So we say Ja'farun and Ja'faran and Ja'farin. We don't ever say Ja'faru and Ja'fara. So, but here he changes it as if it were غير munsarif, and he makes it Ja'fara simply for the metric. So to just correct this, please put that alif there. And you pronounce it that way too. قال محمد هو ابن جعفر لقب كتان عليه قد جرى. Muhammad said, the son of Ja'far, widely known by a name from selling linen. Here he is telling you that the author of this poem is Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Qattani. And many poems begin like that, as you probably know. The poem is a very basic poem. The poem is telling us only the most important things. The verses are used very economically. So why does he begin by talking about himself? It's like you don't have very much space. So why do you tell us your name? Obviously, this has to be important. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done it. And the importance here is because of the fact, as Shaykh Walid has said, that this is a religion of transmission. This is a religion of sanad. And therefore, we don't get knowledge of this religion just by going to the internet or buying a book in a store and going back and reading it. You know, we need to have teachers, and we need to know who they are. And we have to know that they are worthy of teaching this discipline. So therefore, it is very important that he begin with the subjective aspect. It's not an issue of pride, or it's not an issue of anything else. It's that we have to know where we are getting this poem from. And we have to know that the person who is writing this poem and giving it to us is a scholar who is authorized and who is worthy of transmitting this information. Okay, so this is very important. And therefore he begins the poem that way. That I am Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Qattani. And without any claims, without any pride or anything like that, that I am authorized to teach this to you. I have the authority to do that. So we know who is the author of the poem. You know, we don't take our religion from texts that we don't know where they came from, even though they look very good. And we know that he has the authority to teach this poem. And then also we have to know that this is the poem that he taught and that has come to us. And that's where I would come in, because I received this from my Shaykh, who took it from his Shaykh, who took it from his Shaykh, who was Muhammad Ahmed al-Dindarawi, who is the one who actually asked Shaykh Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Qattani to write the poem, and this is the way we received it. So therefore, this is an issue of transmission. And the issue of transmission and the validity and the authority of that, it comes first. You know, that this religion is knowledge, and therefore we have to know from whom did we get this knowledge. And then he says after that, حمدا لمن أوجدنا من العدم وخصنا بخير من له القدم. حمدا لمن أوجدنا من العدم وخصنا بخير من له القدم. Out of praise of God, who gave us existence from non-existence and gave us special distinction through our Prophet, the best of those having preeminence. And here I've used the word God, and I want to talk about that a little bit before we go on to other things. Among us as Muslims, it is natural that we prefer the word Allah when we talk about the Creator. The word Allah is the most beautiful and the most comprehensive of all of the names of God. And we know from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that Allah has 99 most beautiful names, which if anyone memorizes them and preserves their sanctity, he or she will go to the garden. Okay, so Allah has many names, and the 99 foundational names that He has are not His only names. He has infinite other names, those that are known through the Quran and through the Hadith, and those that are known to God alone, and others as well. So Allah doesn't have just one name. In Aramaic, which is probably the language of Jesus, we don't know what language Jesus actually taught in. which is an indication of what? That his message was lost, right? Because if we had his book, we would certainly know what language his book was in. But we don't have that book in its original language. We only have translations of that book in Greek or in Syriac, but the Syriac translations are translations of the Greek. So it means that that Aramaic text, if it was Aramaic, was lost. But Jesus, peace be upon him, probably did teach in Aramaic. And in Aramaic, the word for God is Allah, which is, again, exactly the same root from which we get the word Allah. Allah is the great name of God. But messengers were sent to all peoples on earth. And all peoples on earth have the knowledge of God instinctively in their hearts. Are they not able to express that in their tongues? Is an Englishman not able to use a word that validly expresses the meaning of God? Does he have to wait until someone comes to him and teaches him the Arabic word? That is absurd. Absolutely. And that is also theologically very problematic, because it is like a rejection of the categorical belief that human beings know God instinctively and that God sent messengers to all the peoples on earth. So human languages have words for God. The English word God, which is thousands of years old and is much older than Moses and much older than Christianity, is an Indo-European word, which in terms of its root meaning means he who is supplicated. As the word in Arabic, ilah, which is the basic word for God, it means he who is mad'u, or he who is worshipped. So God, al-ilah is al-ma'bud bihaq, he who is worshipped by right. That's the way that our scholars interpret that word. Eliha is to worship, and ilah, which is God, is the one who is ma'lu, the one who is worshipped. Just like the word kitab in Arabic, book, is the maktub. Okay, so the Indo-European word God is a legitimate word. And you need to understand that. And, our religion is a religion that affirms continuity with other peoples and other traditions. Many Muslims today, in the ideologies of our time, they believe the opposite. That wherever Islam comes, it is culturally predatory. And it destroys what was there before and replaces it. And this is not our tradition. If you look at these beautiful Ottoman mosques that we see in Turkey, these were consciously patterned on the Orthodox Church as a type of sacred space, which the Ottomans are not going to imitate, but which they are going to build their mosques in such a way that it honors that tradition, and it builds upon it a new tradition which is pure and more deep. The Andalusian mosque was based on the Roman basilica, out of respect of the Roman basilica, with Visigothic and Gothic changes. When the Muslims first go to India, which is probably in the days of the successors of the companions, the Tabi'een, they build the most beautiful mosques, some of the most beautiful I've ever seen, along the coast of Kerala in southern India. There are like 13 or 14 of these mosques, and they are cosmic mountains. That's what they would be called in the Hindu-Buddhist tradition. They have and the Indonesian and the Malaysian mosques were that way as well. So they affirm something which is recognized as sacred in the Indian tradition, and then they build on it. This is what the Muslims did everywhere they went. And so therefore they are the heirs of the cultures before them. And they build on the basis of that. And, so therefore also when we speak to our own people in the English language or in the French language or the Spanish language, it's very important to understand what the words in their languages mean and to use those words intelligently. But to take a position that seems implicitly to indicate that you don't have a word for God, that all these hundreds of years you never knew who your creator was, you don't have a word in your language that can adequately express that, that's a very wrong position and a very dangerous position. And then also it makes it difficult for us to communicate. I think it is very important for us, to habituate ourselves to use the English word God. And again, in the English language, the oldest document that we have of the English language in literature is the poem Beowulf. Probably all of you studied this. Beowulf is an old poem. It's an ancient poem that probably goes back to 200 years or so before the prophet. And this poem is really remarkable. The whole poem is monotheistic. It is not a pagan poem. In fact, the poem attacks the paganism of the Saxons who are pagans. And it affirms the monotheism of Saxons who are monotheists. And the poem uses over 30 words for God, which are beautiful names for God. And this is the treasure that God gave to the peoples of ancient times. And if we look in ancient Egyptian, or in Sanskrit, or ancient Iranian, or Chinese, we find the same thing. Human beings knew their Lord, and they were able to speak about him in their languages. They didn't have to wait to learn a foreign tongue. In the 20th century, there was a great study that was done of primitive religions. And this is by a German anthropologist whose name is Wilhelm Smith. And his book has never been translated into English. It's a huge book. But in this, he attempted, through his researchers and through his access to different information, to study all the religions on earth of so-called primitive people. And primitive people, we don't like that. It's not a nice word. It's a pejorative word. We shouldn't use that. But the definition of a primitive people is that they are people who live in kinship groups. They don't have political systems. They don't have kings. They don't have parliaments. They are small societies. And for that reason, some people refer to primitive people as micro societies, micro cultures, because they're small. Everyone in the society is the same family. And authority in these societies is based on your kinship. Who is the elder? Who are the elders? Who are the cousins? And so forth. Primitive societies of the world, like the Eskimos and the Bushmen of Kalahari and a number of tribes in southern Sudan, in the Nile, the pygmies of the Andaman Islands and the pygmies of the African forests. You have Native Americans, for example, in Tierra del Fuego, in the very tip of South America. We have some in what is today the United States, but very, very few. Most Native Americans were actually political people. They were tribes. They were big groups. Okay, so he studied all of these, the Aborigines of Australia and so forth. And in his book, Wilhelm Schmidt establishes that primitive religion was never animist. This is one of the things that we're often taught in our universities, right? That primitive people, they sort of developed the idea of religion, and they are animists, they worship spirits, they worship trees and things like that. And he shows that's not the case at all. That wherever you find a micro-society, you will find that they believe in one God. Their religion may be based on a belief that that God is no longer accessible. It may be based also on things like interceding with him through ancestors or relatives or things like that. And we're not saying here, or he's not saying here, that their belief is necessarily a pure and valid monotheistic belief. But it's very clear that that's what they had. That these are people like the Arabs of Jahiliyyah who believed in one God, who is pre-existent, who has no beginning and no end, whose nature is perfect, who is the source of good and morality. And the names that they give to that God in all their different languages are names that indicate his perfection and his divinity and the distinct difference between him and creation. So this is a really important point. You are the heir of that. You are not the rejecter of that. You know, it is your purpose to take the traditions of the past and to connect them to their root, not to cut off that root. So this is really important. The word God is a beautiful word. It is the most beautiful word in the English language. And it is good for us to make the habit of using that word and not to feel strange when we do that. And why would we feel that way anyway? It's because of ideology. Because in the 20th century, we were exposed to Islamic political ideologies that were often based on the most simplistic understanding of Islam in our tradition, and that perhaps because they came out of a post-colonial, anti-colonial political environment, they also are based on a sort of rejection of the other and a denial of the other. And therefore, you know, we have this, you don't have anything. We are the ones who know God, you don't know God. This is not our tradition. And this was never our tradition. And for that reason, wherever Islam went, traditionally, it linked up with the sacred traditions of the past. And it affirmed in them what was good, even their sacred architecture. Although it doesn't adopt it exactly like it was, but it usually adopts it in such a way that the people of that culture can recognize that this is a sacred building. This is the history of the Indonesian mosque and the Malaysian mosque, of the Chinese mosque, you know, of the Central Asian mosques, you know, and everywhere we went. I've never seen anything written about that. But it's as if Muslims understood that instinctively. Okay, in the Latin languages like French and Italian and Spanish and so forth, you have the word Dios, God, or Dieu, Dio. And this is also a valid name of God. And its origin in Indo-European linguistics is An-Nur. And this is one of the names of God. We have the same word in the English language, which is the word that you have in the name Tuesday. Tuesday, which was Tiu. Tiu was the god of light. The word Tiu meant light, which becomes Dios, Dieu in the other languages. So it's important for us to speak to people in their languages and to use the language. And another thing too is that in the Western tradition, one of the attacks of the Christian church against Islam was to say that we worship God and Muslims worship Allah. And Allah is a different God. He's not a God we know. This is a lie. This is a total fabrication. Allah is in fact linguistically exactly the same word that is used for God in the Hebrew Bible and the Syriac and Aramaic Gospels. But in speaking to the people, we need to use their languages. And especially for many Christians, when I was brought up as a Protestant Christian. And this is definitely what we were taught, that we are people who worship God, the God of Abraham, the God of Moses, the God of Jesus. And Muslims worship a different God, Allah. And, many Christians don't have that background today. Not everybody in the West today has that kind of education that I had, for example, as a Protestant Christian in the mid-20th century. But nevertheless, the churches are doing that again. And this is a type of propaganda that you see quite commonly in the Christian right today. So it's really important to undercut that. We have to defend the faith. And one of the ways that we have to defend it is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and to be honest about, what we are and what they are as well. So this is very important. Another thing too is that in your language, the words that you learn from your mother are the words that are in your heart. So that for many people, especially those who were believers, the word God or Gott, the German form of it, or Dios or Dieu, these are words that resonate in our hearts. And they validly resonate in our hearts. And therefore, when you say that praise be to God, or there is no God but God, in other words, we can translate the Shahada halfway. We can say there is no God, but we can't say God. I mean, when you can do that, then they understand. Then it goes into the heart. And then also there is a continuity here. That we are not here to reject you. We are here to take your hand. And whatever was correct in what you did, we affirm that. And whatever was mistaken, we will correct that. That is very important to do. So I recommend that. For many of us today in Muslim communities, when I give a khutbah, for example, I make it a point to use the word God. Usually there'll be someone to come up afterwards. One of our wonderful uncles who don't know how to keep quiet, It's like, Rahimallahu imra'an arafa qadra nafsihi wa waqafa dunahu. May God have a mercy on a person who knows himself, knows his true status, and who stands below it, not above it. It's very important for us to learn also that the scholar has a special position in this religion. And the scholar also has the authority to do da'wah and the obligation to do da'wah. We have to create scholars who can do that. But people will nevertheless come up to you and say, brother, you said God. And, you can't do this. This is haram. You have to use the word Allah. So may Allah enable us to get beyond that. These are things that were instilled in us by very authoritarian people who insisted on a particular way without knowledge. And without knowledge of the implications. That do you disbelieve in God? What does that mean? And you don't believe that people have the ability to say this word. So inshallah, I will use this word, and I recommend to you that you make a habit to do that as well.